There was much jubilation in the conservative libertarian camp at the end of January as news of Jacinda Ardern's sudden resignation lit up the internet and legacy news channels within minutes, and everyone had something to say about it. Tucker Carlson even threw in his 2 cents. The opinion split was predictable, with the bulk of the corporate media engaging in breathless eulogising and earnest tribute, and the conservative outliers gloating at her demise. I count myself among the gloaters. As a New Zealand citizen and a human rights absolutist, I despise Ardern both for what she did to my country and for the Trojan horse that her cult of personality has provided the sociopaths at the World Economic Forum to use in their pursuit of a global techno-communist reset. And so I happily gloat, not only at her own crestfallen visage, but also, more so even, at the shell-shocked bleating of her legions of fangirls. My use of a singular gender here is deliberate. But I also recognise that her departure is not a victory for us on the nominal right. In fact, I believe this was part of the game plan from the start. I predicted as early as Ardern's 2020 election victory that she would not go on to run for a 3rd term, but would step down and swan off to a job at the UN or another similar globalist organisation. This, I believe, has always been her endgame. She has always seen New Zealand as a stepping stone on her way to much grander things. This is what people need to understand about Ardern and her ilk. They don't believe in nations. To them, real power can only be wielded globally. But I think in the end she did perhaps want to go on for a 3rd term. Her somewhat believable emotions on the podium as she gave her resignation speech would suggest as much. I think she would have liked to equal the tenure of her heroine and mentor Helen Clark, and that her transfer to the UN could have waited, in her mind at least, until 2026. Fundamentally, I think Jacinda got a taste for absolute power, something she hadn't quite counted on when she took office, not to mention the constant media fawning she has enjoyed. She'll be a less visible figure in Geneva or Brussels or wherever they decide to park her. Her scope will be broader, but she'll be less loved by the credulous masses, and I think her ego yearned for 3 more years in the spotlight. But she was always ultimately going to do what her handlers in Switzerland wanted, and someone up there has seen the writing on the wall. New Zealanders have had enough of her bullshit. And so they're bringing her home. I give it about 6 months. Time enough for a wedding to her shady fiancé, Clark Gayford. Perhaps the announcement of a 2nd baby, for which I wonder if the New Zealand taxpayer will foot the bill for her inevitable IVF treatment, ageing hag that she is. And then off to Europe to join her true family. How then is this a victory for we who despise the woman and all that she stands for? A victory would have been watching her suffer an embarrassing defeat in October, and then sliding into political irrelevance before facing a mounting tide of public inquiry over her criminal culpability in New Zealand's lockdowns and vaccine mandate debacle. Victory would have been watching her age daily before our eyes, pathetically trying to deflect the nation's scorn, with her condescending, squinty-eyed smirk and her ludicrously exaggerated head-cocking and arm-waving, and eventually evaporating into shameful ignominy, or better still, languishing in prison where she belongs. That would have been a victory. But instead, she's getting out before the whole thing implodes, exiting to a fanfare of media adulation under the oily auspices of having nothing left in the tank, an outrageous wad of PR spin, even by her standards. She'll be whisked away to a cushy job and an opulent apartment in one of Europe's elite enclaves, where she'll receive the same or even more than the $470,000 annual salary that I and my fellow Kiwis paid her to single-handedly ruin New Zealand with her neo-Marxist technocratic policies. And from there, she'll continue to advance the same agenda, but on a global scale. This is not a victory. It's a sick joke. And we see it mirrored recently and with increasing frequency across the English-speaking West and the governments that have most fervently adopted the program of the WEF. Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss. How long will their boy Rishi last? It really doesn't matter, you see, as long as the agenda advances. You can look for a similar move from the Biden camp in the not-too-distant future. I give them about 6 months. This is becoming a standard play. Insert or co-opt the leader of a government, use them to advance the Great Reset agenda, retire them when the public become fed up, then slot in the next puppet. This brings us to the second reason why Ardern's resignation is not a victory. Nothing will change. Nobody's expecting anything from the Weasley former Minister of Education, Chris Hipkins, now New Zealand's Prime Minister. I believe he's either been chosen as the fall guy, an unlikable white man on whom Labour can blame their forthcoming defeat, or as a steward, to be shunted aside 6 weeks before the election to make way for a wildcard candidate, such as was Jacinda Ardern originally. Regardless, nothing will change under this craven administration, no matter who's at the helm, and they will likely ram through as much socialism, Maori co-governance and net zero rubbish as they can before the October election. But this is not the truly concerning thing. When the so-called Conservative coalition of the National and ACT parties inevitably takes office later this year, they will do exactly as the Conservatives in the UK have done for the past 13 years. They will slow the creeping cancer of wokeism and globalist technocracy, but they will not stop it, much less reverse it. New Zealand will continue along its path toward net zero, mincing along dutifully to the Pied Piper tune of the UN's Agenda 2030. New Zealand will continue to entertain the radical co-governance program championed by Ardern that would see democratic parliament subverted in favour of a race-based caste system. The same agenda is now beginning to flourish in Australia under the guise of the Indigenous voice, exactly as I predicted when the Albanese government took office. A National ACT coalition government in New Zealand would likely slow this process to a crawl, perhaps even stalling it altogether until the next Labour government comes along. But the point is, it will remain on the table. New Zealand will continue to gradually implement the globalist policies of the World Economic Forum, the UN, the multinational banks and asset managers, including, but by no means limited to, sending taxpayer money to prolong the war in Ukraine, enabling Pfizer and the rest of the big pharma complex in their ongoing criminal enterprise, selling off our land and resources to China and cooperating with the CCP on political and economic matters, ratifying the WHO's pandemic treaty, which gives this organ of the WEF effective world government powers in the event of another pandemic, the creeping incursion of hate speech legislation, and of course, allowing the scourge of LGBTQ pride to infect our institutions. How do I know all this? Because experience has yet to suggest otherwise. I'll happily eat these words if, come October, New Zealanders elect a ballsy populist coalition in which the neoliberal so-called National Party are moved to serious reformist action by the smaller parties such as ACT and New Conservative. But what's more likely is that National will win enough votes to govern with a little help from ACT, and the status quo will roll on as it always has. ACT will behave as a handbrake on National, who are effectively the same as Labour, just slightly less woke, but no major policy decisions of the last 3 years will be rolled back, and things like the healthcare vaccine mandate will likely remain in place. To hope for anything more than this is blind optimism at best and contemptible naivety at worst. It is manifestly clear that both sides of the West's two-party paradigm are bought and paid for by the globalist interests of the World Economic Forum, BlackRock, George Soros and the rest. Experience has confirmed this to date, and until proven otherwise, we can expect more of the same from our political system, not just in New Zealand and Australia, but everywhere. The USA, ever the bastion of freedom, and for all its faults, did have a brief and imperfect reprieve under Donald Trump, and the recent ascendancy of the Freedom Caucus in the US House of Representatives is a positive sign. But it's going to take a lot more than these marginal victories to reverse the macro trajectory. Many millions more of us need to wake up to the game that is afoot, and the giant con we're being sold. The climate change con, the COVID con, the vaccine con, the racism con, the transgender con, the Ukraine con, the whole goddamn reality we're being presented every day con. Celebrating the demise of politicians like Jacinda Ardern is also a manifestation of the con. They want us to be hopeful, to feel like we've won a victory here. It keeps us complacent and invested in the status quo system, the illusion of change every 3 or 6 years as we switch from red to blue and then back again. What so many fail to realise is that Ardern's departure does not signify a victory for us, but for them. Look at what they've achieved in New Zealand since 2017. To someone like me who moved overseas shortly after Ardern was elected, the place is now almost unrecognisable, culturally speaking. Ardern and her friends at Davos have achieved a resounding victory for their side in New Zealand. Yes, she has failed to meet their criteria for a viable third-term run, but she did not fail in her mission. Am I glad she's leaving? Hell yes. Good riddance to bad rubbish. But this is not our victory, merely the inevitable conclusion to this phase of the ongoing operation to destroy our way of life. Jacinda won't be losing too much sleep over this. Once her bruised ego recovers, it'll be back to business for the woman who once proudly admitted that she had created 2 classes of people. Jacinda Ardern has fundamentally altered the character of New Zealand, perhaps permanently, which is exactly what she set out to do. I call that a victory. Her victory. Thanks for listening. Please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future videos. Please also subscribe to my Substack at jjdawson.substack.com. And if you'd like to keep in touch, please do follow me on Twitter at RealJJDawson. You can also follow me on Getter, Gab, and Minds. And of course, if you enjoyed this, please do give it a like and share it about, because it really helps me out.